And welcome back to A.R. Tales, aka the A.R.T podcast. I am A.R. and today I am joined by Lina Amarego. She is the author of The Children of Lear, new adult fantasy. She calls it Romantasy. First time I've ever seen that, so the term has been coined. It is official throughout the ART podcast family now. Romantasy author of many works, and she is actually the head of the Silver Wheel Press that does fantasy anthologies. Finding more and more out about everything. Without any further ado, how are you doing today, Lina?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. This is such a joy.
Well, one thing that I always immediately just hop into is, how did the love of writing start for you? Was it more of a reading turn writing thing, or was it in reverse somehow?
Absolutely a reading turned writing thing. I read since I was really, really little. My grandmother actually taught me to read before I even went to school. And so books were always a part of my life. And then eventually I was like, maybe I should try this myself. And it went from a hobby to something that I really was passionate about college. And now we're here.
Now that actually is a little interesting to me because the same thing happened to me, that I had always loved reading, but it didn't turn into
Mhm.
writing until very end of my college career for me. So out of curiosity, what was it that you were studying in college?
So not writing even a little bit.
Yeah.
I was actually an acting major in college, and then about halfway through, I added psychology to my course load. So I was studying human behavior basically from two different fronts, right? So I was learning how to perform human behavior and then learning about the inner workings of it at the same time. My main profession is I'm a therapist now. I went to grad school, but I think it really helped me learn how to create characters from a different perspective. And that's when I was really so much more interested in writing, because I felt like I had a much deeper basis on how to craft characters and how to really just relate to people as well.
So then what was your first kind of go at that? Was it a short story? Because like you did say that Silver Wheel Press deals with anthologies. So do you
Mhm.
yourself have a love for anthologies?
I do. Actually, The Children of Lear, before it was a trilogy, was a short story on an online anonymous forum. They were running competitions for short stories where if you submitted, the winner got like $25 gift card to Amazon or something small like that. And I was a broke college student who was absolutely in need of a $25 gift card. So I submitted a short story based on the prompt that they gave. And that short story actually turned into what would later be Daughter of the Deep, which is the first book of the trilogy, which I didn't feel like the story was over then either. And it became a full trilogy. But I love short stories. I think that they're such a great way to just hone your craft and learn about, short form and fast paced, and yet it can still be really deep work. So this last year, we actually did a Seven Deadly Sins anthology, myself and six other writers. It's called A Fate and Fury, just because I love short stories as well, and even though I like writing longer series as well, um, short stories were definitely my first go into it, and I don't want to forget that.
I honestly, I'm a sucker for anthologies too. Short stories, flash fictions. The first thing I ever wrote ever in life was a 300 word flash fiction called No One Noticed the Bees. It was a very
Ooh.
weirdly, yeah, it was like a weirdly apocalyptical uh little like short story that I made, and actually put it on Reddit for the first time. And you already know I got decimated, but I loved writing. Um and just everything about it is awesome, because especially now in recent years, I feel like they're having a major comeback. I feel like 6 years ago
Mm-hmm.
they were, it was like really almost looked down upon. It was like almost like the knowledge that like, oh, short stories don't sell, so there's no point in like writing or getting into them. And it's just like, yeah, but they're awesome. You know,
Mm-hmm.
The Egg. I don't know if you ever like heard of that short story called like The Egg, but
Yes.
I mean, short stories are mythical in my eyes. Like they can really go a distance as far as like understanding very complex situations in a very short time frame.
I also think it's almost harder because when you have a lot of space, you have plenty of room to world build and to character build, right? You can make all these little choices. I think with flash fiction and short stories in general, it's so hard to cram in messages. You have to be so intentional with your words. And I think that that's a really important skill for writers that I'm glad is making a comeback, because I do think it's a really beautiful way to just try and pack as much of a punch in as short of a space as possible.
Yeah, I always compare it to like painting. Like when you have like those
Mm.
like big paintings and they look so incredibly detailed, they only look like that because they're far out. Like when you go in on like the minute level, it's like the paint lines are actually a little blurry. They're not as like
Mm-hmm.
rigid or like insanely detailed as you thought it would be. But like when you have a small little canvas, your margin for errors is zero. You have to be
Yeah.
direct. You have to know where your lines are going, how they go. There's no little fat. And I feel the same way for short stories.
Mm-hmm.
500,000 word epics are amazing, but give me a 500 word short story on the same topic, and I'm going to be way more aligned to the short story.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you referred to that in the sense of mythological as well, right? Because I do think when we look at the evolution of storytelling, right, it was sort of
Mm.
short form myths that really carried, and oral traditions that, people weren't sitting there for hours and hours dictating these long things. And so I do think that there's a really human element to kind of that short fiction, right? When it feels fantastical and it feels bigger than us when you just have that kind of short bite of a story. So I'm such a huge short story fan, and I love the way you characterize that. It does feel like mythological.
Oh my god, yeah, I'm a huge like history buff too. So like, especially like recently, I'm just getting like enamored by the whole like ancient society thing. But two
Mm-hmm.
things that immediately popped into my head when you were talking about like the story of how the whole Amazon gift card thing. Did you win?
Yes, I did actually. I had done two other stories for them that I didn't win, and then this one I did, and the feedback was really positive, and people were like, "You could totally expand on that," and I did, because I fell in love with the world, and I was like, this is one thing I do want to take more room for and more space for."
Well, then it kind of leads into like the obvious. How did the story develop? What is the children? Of course, without getting into too many spoilers, you
Mhm.
already know people, the information that you need, the links will all be in the description and the bio and the caption and the banners if you're watching this on YouTube. Make sure to buy the book. It is up now. Well worth the read. The trilogy is up. So you can go ahead and dive into the full story. So make sure to do that. Well worth it. Children of Lear, give it a read. But without giving into any spoilers, how did the story develop?
So initially, the prompt for the short story actually was write about a blood feud of some kind and make it set in some type of seafaring setting. So I am a really big mythology buff, right? If that hasn't already been established. And the first things that came to mind for me was sort of like a Romeo and Juliet family feud, and having a couple in the sort of center of that, navigating that. And of course, I love Welsh myths. So there is the story of Lear, which is a Welsh god of the sea. And I kind of tried to incorporate that into it. But the first book itself is really in the aftermath of this blood feud between the two main families, right? The Brenwins and the Mathenwys. And Kira, the main character, is really grieving over the death of her father, right? She believes that the person that she thought was her childhood best friend and sort of crush killed him, right? So she believes Ronan was the one who killed her father. That's what sparked this whole blood feud. And the council of the island that they live on decides that they're putting an end to it, right? It's having too much of a destructive impact on their society. So they suggest that they unite the clans to sort of end the feud. And of course, that looks like an arranged marriage in this time period. So Kira is actually required to marry the person that she was totally in love with as a child and a young adult, and the person that she also thinks killed her father. And of course, chaos ensues. Ronan professes his innocence, right? And there's a whole lot of twists and turns that I won't get into because I don't want to spoil it for anybody. But that's sort of the premise, and it grew from there into a trilogy.
Oh my God. So then how did you develop the mythical aspects of it, the history of it? Was it something that you started just tearing apart through like that type of historical period, getting into documentaries, or was it more that you wanted to focus on the fantastical aspects of it? So you kind of went with your own information and then kind of went along with the rest.
Yeah, no, it's definitely my own interpretation. It's not historical fantasy, so it's not placed specifically in a time period, right? It's in its own sort of alternate world, but pulling from heavily the myths that I really loved, right? Some broader Celtic mythology, but mostly that Welsh footprint, just because I don't think it gets enough recognition, right? I feel like I see a lot of Greek retellings. I feel like I see a lot of Norse retellings. And I think Celtic mythology is so weird and wonderful that I wanted to find ways to sprinkle that in, right? So a lot of the religion of the island and a lot of the gods are referenced and have a larger part of it. Some of the mythical creatures that are in the mythology get referenced throughout the series. So I really wanted to use that reference material, but then also it is its own world and make it its own thing as well.
Now, I guess I fall in that into like that little hole there because I also hugely love Norse and Greek and Roman mythologies, but don't know too much about the Celtic, if I'm being completely honest. What would you say is what differs? What is it that calls to you about the Celtic mythology versus the other ones?
I love that there are so many different interpretations of Celtic myths, right? So when you look at Welsh, Irish, and just broader Anglo-Saxon mythology, they had, for some reason, so many different versions of the same things. And it's because, there were different, cultural pockets. I feel like what I also respect about some of these other myths, it's right, there is almost this canon in the mythology, right, around certain gods where everybody was kind of telling the same stories. Whereas what's so cool about Welsh is they were all kind of telling their own version at the same time. And I love that sense of, mystery even within that, right? Which version is the real version? And I think that's what lends it to fantasy so well, is that I can pick moments from different interpretations and kind of weave together my own narrative of how it all interacts.
Now that is really interesting because I've always considered that mythology in just its own sense is hundreds of people's different point of views on like an event that happened globally. So the fact that Celtic is even divided between that kind of does lend itself for like really interesting storytelling because everything is a point of view.
Yeah, and when you think about it, that's such a small area of the world geographically. So the fact that we have so many different interpretations on a relatively small island, right? The UK and that Celtic area is not a very large geographical map. Whereas, when you think of the Greek and Roman Empire, really sprawled a much larger space. So you'd think that there'd be more differentiation in across a wider spread area. But no, I think it's so interesting that essentially these people were all living on top of each other, but because they were so nomadic and the tribes and all of that, right? It was so convoluted and there's so many different arguments even between those facets. So I thought it was such a really cool mythology, and it added that whimsy for it to me that I loved and I wanted to represent.
Well, and again, with my limited knowledge of Celtic like lore, one thing that always interested me is I've always been fascinated by like shamanism, like just like that type of like spirituality and how like they were like the leaders of like their respective cultures at the time. From what I understand, Celtic is the only one that like dabbled in like Druidism, right? Why? And it lets a great question because shamanism is global. Every society dabble with shamanism, but like you said, one little island off the coast of what we consider now Europe is somehow dabbling with Judaism. Why? How did that even come to happen?
I don't know, right? I'm not that deep into the history, but I do think it's so interesting that their interpretations are really different from other places in the area during those time periods. So I think that is a really cool question, and I'd love to know the answer if there are any historians out there that have it.
Well, I was more asking from like a writing standpoint, right? Like the
Mm,
to me the difference between shamanism and like Judaism was that like Judaism was more like animal and like nature based, right? Well, I guess
mhm,
shamanism is as well, but I guess there's more like elemental. Again,
mhm.
very rough knowledge that I have about this type of stuff. From that type of standpoint, like and also the banshee myth also comes from Celtic lore as well, right? So they kind of like had like a deep like feeling of like spirits and like fucking like other worlds and whatnot.
Mhm.
It just like makes me wonder like how did that also go with Judaism? And did you develop any of that type of like mysticism into your book directly?
Yeah, so I think you hit it on the head, right? It is a very elemental and nature-based mythology, right? So there are again some creatures that I bring in. So I don't know if you've heard of it, right? But the Kefeldweir is a mythological fae seahorse, right? That they lure people into rivers and springs and oceans, right? Um, Sort of steal their soul, right? And I think that there's a lot of that kind of spooky, not quite natural but supernatural mythology within the lexicon, right? Like you said, banshees, right, or even just the fair folk in general. And I think that's where a lot of like Arthurian and Fae lore gets its sort of origin. So my series doesn't actually use Fae terminology, but it's more just the pre-origin, some of those stories that kind of inspired other um, mythologies, in general. But I do think it's a very cool blend of natural and then supernatural as well.
God. I have never really gotten like so in depth about like the more mythical aspects of the fantasies now, but now that we're talking about it, I don't understand how I haven't like just like focused more around it because it is absolutely phenomenal. But considering that, do you think that, especially considering your love for Celtic lore, do you ever think that you'll go into other realms of kind of like
Mm-hmm.
unpopular lore, African lore? Honestly, I mean, I couldn't even think of other ones. Australian, right? Australian like lore around that time frame was pretty like nuts too.
Yeah. I mean, I love different interpretations. I absolutely could see myself branching into other mythologies later in different works and stuff. At the same time, I always want to be really cognizant of making sure that I'm not like appropriating any cultures
Hmm.
or stealing from cultures that I do not have any, claim to. So I think that's where to kind of go back to anthologies, that would probably be a project where I would ask other authors to write as well, maybe from their own personal histories, their own voices, and add to maybe a greater collect work. That way, I'm not necessarily stealing from cultures that I have no claim to as well, right? And I think that's a really important line that, as a white author, I have to be cognizant of.
Hmm. That is interesting. Well, do you think that that level of care that you put into making sure that everything with the Celtic lore is going to happen, do you think it will ever branch out into different genres? Do you ever think that you'll kind of stay within like, the Celtic lore, but then try maybe a young adult romance? Do you ever think that you'll branch off into maybe doing some comedy or horror aspects of it, but like within the because especially Celtic, I think lends itself to some really cool horror themes if you kind of like decided to like write
Mhm.
about it. Do you ever think that you'll branch out to other genres within that sphere of the Celtic lore?
Yeah, and not to say that I'm only ever going to stick with Celtic, right?
Hmm.
I do think just broader European is kind of open for lots of interpretation, just because it's not as culturally specific. I just mean I never would never want to like take um, a practice or a culture that is currently still has active participants and appropriate that. I think that there's a fine line between inspiration and appropriation, and I want to make sure that I'm being inspired by different things without taking it on and rebranding it as my own necessarily. But that being said, I do think myself branching into other genres going forward. This is new adult fantasy, and that's sort of in that middle ground between young adult and adult. Whereas my next projects are definitely more on the adult side, right? I started this when I was in my early 20s, and now I'm getting into my later 20s, and it doesn't necessarily feel as impactful for me to write for younger audiences. So I do think as I'm growing up, my writing is growing up with me. And although I don't necessarily see myself in the immediate future writing different genres, right? I do love my fantasy and romance and mythological retellings. I've actually been critique partnering for some friends that are more in the horror genre, and I'm loving reading that work. So I think it could be something eventually that I branch into, but that's I got a lot of stuff on my plate before then.
Well, I definitely get that. Now, one thing that I do love about the whole anthology series that you're going on with is just how much it can branch off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, specifically when it comes to like the romance aspects of it as well, how do you delineate like which one should have more influence on another? Like, how do you know to focus more on the romance of it more than the fantasy more than the romance? And then how do you actually gauge the romantic filter itself? Is it very hardcore erotica? Is it more just sensual love between one another? How do you treat that as well?
Yeah, I think that's honestly a really important discussion to have because I do notice there's kind of real gray area in the genre right now where some authors are marketing some pretty like intense, spicy
Hmm.
content and fantasy to young adult readers, and then vice versa. People that are marketing it as romance, and then it's like not actually romance. So for my work, I try to always put the fantasy first, right? Because at the end of the day, that's the story I want to tell, and it is plot driven and character. But that being said, I think that love is a really important part of most people's development and their stories. I'm a couples therapist, right? So I get the privilege of seeing people's love stories play out day in and day out, and I do know how important that is. So I think the fantasy really comes first. I want to build the world. I want to have a plot, and then the romance is woven throughout it. And for this series, it kind of grew with the series. I think in the first book, the romance was maybe a little bit more on the forefront because that would be the part of the struggle that they were in, right? My characters dealing with their grief and dealing with the impact of everything that's happened and then allow themselves to really connect with each other. I thought that was part of the plot, really, to unify. And through that, I think love was the avenue to do that. But then later on, right, as not to spoil things, other things came up and there was more importance. It took a little bit of a seat, and that's not to say that it's not in the books at all, right? But it wasn't as much of the focus. So I do think that that's an important thing to just know what's more important for the story you're telling. That being said, also just really understanding the needs of the genre, right? So I do absolutely have some more romantic, intimate scenes in the books, but the way I try to go about it is not necessarily super vulgar or super detailed. I think that there is absolutely a time and a genre and a place for that, right, in the more erotica field, but that's not necessarily what I'm writing. And I totally respect and love authors who do write that, but that's not what this story is about. Whereas if I ever was going to just decide to write pure romance or pure erotica, right, I might be more detailed and more in your face about some of the exact specifics of those scenes. Where in the Children of Lear specifically, the scenes are there. It's not like necessarily a cut to black either, but it's done in a way where it's not excruciatingly detailed and,
Hmm.
with language that is really just in your face about it. It's more of a poetic glance over the moment.
Now, I do love everything that you said about that, because it is a conversation that I feel like is a little. I mean, when you consider a movie like The Notebook, there's no doubt that's a romance. But then arguably a movie like
Mhm.
Deadpool could be considered a romance because it's the character's main point of like action throughout the entire movie is a love for a person. They have the
Mhm.
scene where they meet each other, they fall in love. It's no question in your mind as from the audience that they're in love. So like puts the question of like where is where, like what makes
Mhm.
a romance, and when is it considered something else. um and I do love that you put the fantasy first, because now that might be a little bit of my biasum, but just like
Mhm.
when you put like this, it's almost like the Chuck E. Cheese thing. Like you go for the game to stay for the pizza. It's like you show up for like the monsters, but then you like stay for the relationships. And I think that's like what
Mhm.
makes the story like really awesome and really like hit the heart, hit home just like
Mhm.
perfectly. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Now, considering that, and especially like to wrap up because we're getting to the end, unfortunately, this has been such a awesome conversation. I like just talking about myths and everything. But what would you say is the future for you? We've talked about like your possible projects that you might take on, but what is it that you see for yourself in the next, especially what that the year is about to end. So to better change the question now that I think about it, because we actually are towards the end. Time goes so fast now; it's unbelievable. What would you say you're the most proud that you've done this year, and then what are
Mhm.
you looking forward towards next year that you want to do?
Yeah, so this year there's a tie for sure. Finishing Mother of the Moon, which is the last book in the series, and publishing that felt like such a huge accomplishment just because these characters and these books have been with me for almost 4 years now. Um, and to see that sort of chapter close was absolutely so emotional and impactful, and I was really proud of it. Because I think I got in my head at points, right? It was one thing to publish one book, it was one thing to publish two books, but to finish a series really kind of helped me solidify my identity as an author.
Wow.
Um, and then also, to reference again, we did publish the first anthology for Silver Wheel Press, which is A Fate and Fury. It's a Deadly Sin anthology. And that was such a collaborative experience that as an independent author, I think there wasn't a lot of opportunity for me to collaborate. So to have 6 other incredibly talented authors working with me, that was such a fun treat. And I was really, really proud of the product we put out. So both of those projects, and to publish both of them within the year, feels really great. And I'm really proud of what 2022 held. And then as for 2023, I'm really excited that I don't have necessarily anything on the schedule for release. But I am writing another project already because I, don't have any self-control. Um, and I'm looking forward to starting to tease some of that, right? I haven't even announced the title or anything. It's just being affectionately known as Project Shadow King, right? It's another uses some Greek and Latin references, but it's another. This would be my first step into adult fantasy, and it's really a lot of political intrigue and high fantasy and epic ideas, right? And I don't want to spoil much more out of that. So I'm excited to go back sort of into the drafting trenches and really just seeing where that takes me in the new year.
Man, that's awesome. So you said that you actually knocked out both of these books within 1 year?
So Mother of the Moon, I've been writing for 2 years. I started writing it back in 2021 when I was publishing Sister of the Stars, which is the second book in the series. But I finished it at the beginning of this year and published it towards the end. And then the Fate and Fury, the anthology, that was done totally within the span of, I think, 8 months. But of course, I only had to write short stories for that. So it was a little easier to draft and then hop right into edits. And I obviously had other authors writing other stories in tandem. So yeah, both of those were within 2022.
My God, you are a force to be reckoned with. I wish I had that. Uh, I don't even know. And out of curiosity, what are the word counts of each of those books?
Oh, so Mother of the Moon is huge. It clocks in at about 182,000 words.
You're a legend. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
it's a big book. It took me 2 whole years. A Fate and Fury, the word count, I think, is about 120,000, but that's between 8 stories. So I think the stories that I wrote are 13,000 each roughly. So much smaller. And yeah, they're not as chunky for
My
sure.
God, you are a legend. That is unreal. Knocking out like, you know, Game of Thrones level volumes yearly. That is unreal. That is phenomenal. I really do wish you all the best. It's been such a great conversation. I love getting into myths, especially when I like start learning things that I haven't learned before. First time of hearing most of this Celtic stuff. And if you have been at all interested by any of this, and I don't understand how you possibly couldn't, make sure to follow her on Amazon. Hit the plus sign so you get the notification so you can be the first to find out when she drops her latest work. It's going to be well worth it. And of course, you can pick up any of the 3 books from a Children of Lear series out now. Also on Amazon, you can go ahead and follow her on Instagram as well so you can see the process of everything she's doing and just be all in the know. Just don't be a creep. I'm going to have to start wearing that on a shirt. Just reach out and show as much support as possible, but just don't be the typical internet troll. Don't be negative. Just show support and love. And as always, I want to turn over to you and just say if there's anything that you want to talk about before going, anything that we haven't talked about yet, any shout outs that you want to give, now's the time.
Well, I just want to thank you for having me. This was such a fun experience, and thank you for letting me rant about random things. I think that's such a fun atmosphere when it really just feels like a conversation, not necessarily an anxiety-inducing interview. So I really appreciate this environment and the platform. And also, Silver Wheel Press is always looking for new submissions. There will be future anthologies to come and, etc. So please consider following. And if you're an independent author as well and you need some support, my messages are always open for that. I love helping other authors sort of start their journey as well. I received a lot of free advice from some good friends when I was first starting out. So I want to sort of pay that forward. So I'll echo, don't be a creep, but you're welcome to be a friend. I'm definitely all over social media and happy to connect and communicate.
Man, you're like really, really good at like slogans. You know what I mean? Just like saying certain things like Rant and Ramble. I can rename this entire podcast Rant and Ramble. That's the entire essence of what we do here.
Well, you're
Well,
welcome to you.
I might have to. I might have to start drafting it up. You know what? I'll do it for your promos when I start doing that. So check it out. Make sure that it'll be awesome. Well, ironic because the people listening will probably watch the promo in order to listen to this. So they're going to be like, what the? Heads are going to start exploding everywhere across the universe. It's going to be our fault. We just did that. And that's a trope for the next story right there. And on that note, this is going to be the end of the podcast, AR's Tales, aka the A.R.T podcast. I've been AR, and I've been honored by having Lina over here to just chat and talk about the things that she loves, talk about her inspiration, motivations, and as always, pick up her damn book. Stop playing. And we will be back next week with another author, another artist, and we're going to be talking about whatever it is that we're passionate about. And until then, peace out.